what they wanted her to say, and I heard the tape, and it's really pretty bizarre.
Is that when they got power of attorney over
Yes,
too?
that's when
They brought an attorney in. Now, here's the thing. They brought an attorney in. He wrote a power of attorney supposedly on the spur of the moment. The thing is, the power of attorney contained the legal description of the house.
Very interesting.
Which you could only get in the daytime.
That's right.
And my mother, we had an attorney. We had our family attorney, and I had a medical power of attorney and owned all of this property that they were with my mother in joint tenancy, not tenancy in common, joint tenancy. And this had been held in my name, and actually up to a couple of years before there, 3-4 years before that, my mother had held everything in trust for me. But she wanted me to be able to have access it.
That's what they did.
So it was held in joint tenancy for about 4 years.
I'm sorry,
so
I'm interrupting you, dear, but we've got to move here. That's what they did. Rather than write a will, they owned everything jointly. Then, when the time came that her mother would die, she would just own it.
And that's what we had done in the family for years.
Very simple.
Yeah.
Now, from the time she was in United Hospital, and they had also there was a nurse in United Hospital who was called Nancy Massman, who was a continuum of care nurse who was working with Reichstad. We deposed all these people. We deposed Nancy Massman, who's a United Hospital social worker nurse, Ken Reichstad, who's a Dakota County vulnerable adult social worker, Jeffrey Batesel, who's a West St. Paul policeman, and he's also a vulnerable adults worker with Reichstad, and Dennis Bergay, who was an attorney who was working with Reichstad and Batesel.
He drew up the power of attorney.
Right, and basically what happened is that Nancy Massman was very hostile to me when I first came back in January of 1986. And it turns out later is that what happened is they had made, Bessie Krause and Roger Krause had made a connection with Nancy Massman and Reichstad via Nancy Massman before I even arrived here. And the idea was that either I would go back to Europe, and if I didn't go, they would cause some scandal, or accusations against me. And all unknown to me. I can see this in hindsight. So what actually happened is that Bessie Krause called Nancy Massman to report me for abusing my mother. And I have proof of that in the documents. She's the one, Bessie had her do it, so there wouldn't be a direct connection to Roger and Bessie. And then that evening that Roxanne is talking about, which is March 20th, 1986, when they took my mother to the Dakota County Social Services Department, they revoked this power of attorney that I had, and my mother had signed that earlier that day, and then they
revoked it without your being present?
Yeah,
I mean, they can do that?
Yeah.
Well, not really, because it was a durable power of attorney, and that it had much more very express provisions in it. And then they had my mother sign another one, and then they came to the house that evening and came in the house almost like SS officers at about 11 o'clock at night.
Oh, really?
And then and then they were demanding that I hand over, sign things over to them, and I just told them to either arrest me or get out or arrest me finally, and they did finally leave. And it was very, very, I'll never forget that. And then the next day, Roger Krause went to all the banks and took my name off the accounts and put his own name on. This is March 21st. And then there was a succession of things. I hired an attorney to get guardianship of my mother. I was put in that position, and it cost me almost $20,000 from that time until my mother died. And got everything in order and went back to Europe where my fiancé was. And then there was progressive incidents that tried to threaten me to come back and sell the house because they couldn't get the money from the house because I owned it. It's more difficult to transfer property.
Right.
And then they finally wrote a will on July 2nd of 1986. And all this time from about February, from the time my fiancé, there's a lot of other details I can't get in this short time, but he had left, from the time he left in about late February until the day the will was written inside on July 2nd, 1986. My mother's insulin was overdosed. Her insulin was being given, it was given about 20% more than normal. And then it was put back to normal on July 2nd. Right. Then in August...
That would cause confusion to her.
Having too much insulin causes confusion, you know, hysteria, whatever, and you get very, very confused and can't think straight. Then a month later, Roger Krause was diagnosed as having cancer of the pancreas, and he was going to die before my mother. So that was and he actually went into surgery on September 4th, 1986, and it was definitely confirmed that it was inoperable and he was going to die first.
So they had to make
Because-
sure that they
Yeah.
got your mother
Right,
out of the
You
way.
so-
can't
first.
write a will in perpetuity. In other words, if he died first, his inheritance rights that were granted by this will.
Well, let's make it real simple. A
Would
dead
die
person
at
that
that
cannot
point.
Yeah.
inherit. A dead person can't inherit. So,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Warren to jump in here right now. Warren, I'm sure you probably got some things to say. I know you want to focus on the county attorney, and I don't want to clip the story necessarily, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to just kind of remove the specific names from these people for a moment and take their offices and let's see how this scam happens. I'm going to call it a scam. I'm going to call
It
it
is a
a
scam.
murder plot, a murder scam, whatever. What goes on here? What do you know that can be enlightening for the viewing audience?
Well, basically what I'm familiar with is the behavior of Jim Backstrom, who's the county attorney in Dakota County. Mary Jane, throughout this process, or towards the end of this process, had tried to go to the grand jury and access the grand jury because Jim Backstrom refused to prosecute the people involved with Mary Jane's mother's case. And she tried to access the grand jury directly as a witness, and Chief Judge Lynch in Dakota County wrote a letter back to Mary Jane and said that she can't have direct access to the grand jury, which aggrieved citizens should have the right to testify as a witness in front of the grand jury.
and how
try
did you
to-
get this?
and try to get a grand jury to indict. And so when I had a meeting with Jim Backstrom with 2 witnesses present, I always take some witnesses with me when I go in with these officials,
Yeah.
and they gave me a letter because I was trying to access the grand jury myself because Mr. Backstrom refused to prosecute some perjuries and some fraud and extortion and things like this, and an attorney that I wanted prosecuted. So he says you can't access the grand jury because a lady in Dakota County already tried it, and she failed. And Judge Lynch wrote her a letter saying you can't do it, and he hands me this letter. And it was the letter that Judge Lynch had written to Mary Jane denying her access to
Interesting.
the grand jury. And I asked him, of course, I assumed this is my copy. So I got out of that office with the copy, and then I talked with
okay,
Mary
I
Jane
wanna-
later, and then he wrote a follow-up letter just in January when I asked for the name of the foreman of the grand jury. He wrote a return letter, reply letter, again, referring to Mary Jane's letter, saying that this lady in Dakota County couldn't do it, so I can't do it.
So he's
So
using
this
that as
is,
precedent.
you know, this is kind of like an obstruction of justice, and people, there's a lot of selective justice out there, where for one reason or another, county attorneys or city attorneys or even the Attorney General's office will prosecute certain people and not prosecute others.
And this is actually a
So-
cover-up. In my case, it's
Yeah.
obstruction of justice. There is a little bit of a reason. I mean, the county attorney, I think, the county attorney's office were somewhat culpable at the time. They could have, if they had been vigilant at the time, my mother probably wouldn't be dead now. They were not vigilant. They were not supervising these people. And I think it takes more investigation just to say how guilty they were at the time. But they certainly are covering it up now.
How many people within the system are not corrupt?
Well, let's.
How many of them are connected?
We can probably cover this in the murder and cover them both at the same time because they're closely connected. One thing we haven't talked about yet was the actual murder.
Well, let's talk about that. Do you want to do that?
Well, it was taking, okay.
Let me let Roxanne
Okay, well,
jump into
I'm
that.
maybe more familiar with the nursing home records and so on.
Well, I don't
okay,
know.
Okay,
Well,
okay.
let me give it
okay.
a shot here.
Okay.
Basically what had happened was Roger and Bessie Krause had tucked Jane away in this nursing home where she was safe as far as they were concerned. Then Roger Krause finds out he's going to die first. So in order to keep the will in effect, Jane's got to die first. Otherwise, all the rights are going to go bye-bye. So we'll go right to October 22nd. The patient care committee at the nursing home had a meeting about Jane. They decided that she was stable or very slowly deteriorating.
And that she's the same as
They-
she was for the last
Yeah, it was basically the same as she had
6
been there
months.
since June or July?
April.
April. Now the following day, Dr. Victor Corbett, who was Jane's endocrinologist,